Today we're going to be talking about Appspace deployment best practices. Before we get started, just a couple of quick notes. If you don't know who I am, I'm Will White. I'm a consulting systems engineer at Appspace. If you've never been on one of our webinars before, it's good to meet you guys. If you have, then you probably have gotten to know me by now, and you've been able to watch the progression of my hair as it gets longer and longer. I still haven't gotten my post-quarantine haircut. And if you were on yesterday's webinar, you've already heard that joke. So really building up a repertoire here. So moving on from that, just a couple of quick programming notes. One, this webinar should be pretty interesting. We're going to jump back and forth between some high-level talking points as well as some kind of hands-on demo and training in the platform itself. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between slides and Appspace directly. So hopefully you can follow along there, but just a fair bit of warning. Another couple of quick notes. There is a Q&A feature in WebEx. So as we're going through, if you have any questions, any thoughts, feel free to drop those in that Q&A feature. I'm going to try to reserve a little bit of time at the end of the call to answer those if we can. If I can't get to them all, then we can take those as follow-up. If you see like some common trends, common questions that are being asked, we can certainly have those as a takeaway. Lastly, I'll touch on this again later, but there is a survey after the webinar. So once this ends, you're going to get redirected to it. If you wouldn't mind filling that, it's a huge help to us. Helps us know what you actually want to see, right? What we should do for webinars, what was helpful, what wasn't. So definitely, if you wouldn't mind clicking through, that'd be great. So let's go ahead and jump in. Like I said, today we're talking about deployment best practices. Now, this is a pretty big topic. There's a lot to discuss, especially if you're talking about a full enterprise deployment, right, across tons of offices and departments and things like that. But even if you're talking about a small deployment, there's a lot here that's worth thinking about. So that being said, this webinar, it will probably act kind of like a starter conversation for everyone, right? Like I said, we're going to talk big pictures. We're going to look at some use cases, how to actually implement it in the platform. I doubt we'll cover everything that might be top of mind, but hoping to give you some good info, some good things to think about. And then, of course, you can always work with us, work with your customer success manager, our customer success team more broadly, our support team, your account managers, et cetera, on these kind of topics as you think about your Appspace deployment, as you roll it out, or even as you continue to roll it out, right? As you revisit some of these things for maybe a deployment that's been going on for years. One of the big things that I always like to stress when thinking about an optimal Appspace deployment, right? Best strategies around making sure your deployment works the way it needs to, is kind of the planning stage, right? So defining your goals ahead of time, thinking about what you want to accomplish ahead of time. Anytime I'm working with a new Appspace user, new Appspace subscriber, I always recommend that before you even get to the interface, right? Maybe you've done a demo, maybe you've played around personally, that's fine. But before you even really jump in and start getting your hands dirty, it's worth it to just take time to think about how it should work. Again, not even thinking about like Appspace roles, any of that kind of stuff. Think about the kind of content you need to publish, how you need to publish it, who's going to be involved, where is that content coming from, what user roles do you have? Again, not even in Appspace terms, but I need a user that does this, I need a user that does that, they need access to these screens and not these screens, they need to approve this and not. Those kind of more like plain language or natural language ideas around what should be happening with your deployment. So we've got a few questions here that can kind of help with that. Primarily, what do you want to achieve with the platform, right? It's a communication tool. It gives you the ability to get content where it needs to go in front of the eyes that need to see it. But what is the actual goal there? How are you going to know that you've been successful? How are your colleagues, your superiors, whoever, right? How are they going to know that it was a success? Further, what does good communication look like in your organization? So you can communicate all you want. You can shoot content out there. But what does good communication look like? How are you delivering content? Where is it going? How often is it being updated? Who's contributing that content? That's a big one. Having a mixture of different voices is always helpful. And then lastly, what's the purpose of investing in this project? And are there defined outcomes and how will you measure them? Those are important too. It's not just about getting Appspace up and going, getting it structured properly, making it effective, but what's that end state, right? What's that ideal world? What does it look like when all the people that you want to contribute are contributing and contributing often, or able to do so easily, and within brand guidelines and all those kind of things. Now I'm on our sales team, so if you want to get an Appspace subscription and deploy it without thinking about these things, I'm not going to stop you. But we always want people to be successful with the platform. We want it to be engaging. We want it to be useful. We want it to be easy to use. So 100% recommend thinking about these kind of things. And again, after this webinar, if you still got thoughts, if you're still trying to define these kind of things, definitely reach out to your contacts here, and we can help you out. So let's start digging into the actual kind of nitty gritty of it all. This slide is about getting organized. The next slide will be a little bit about users and kind of their roles and how you would manage that. I only mention that, or I only kind of peek ahead because these topics are so intertwined, right? You want to make sure that your deployment is organized, that it makes sense, that it's easy to maintain. And a lot of that ultimately comes down to the users, both what the users can do, how the users should use the platform. So we're probably going to be bouncing back and forth between those two topics pretty freely. But we're going to start here with kind of the base organizational elements, because it seems like the kind of obvious place to start. Now, a lot of this, what we're discussing here, is really on the content side of things. We'll get to kind of the more management, organizational, like devices side here in a bit. But starting with content, because that's where most users live their lives, producing content and publishing it out. First things first, let's talk a little bit about the content library. Pretty much everyone that uses Appspace is going to use the library, unless your role is strictly to just look at devices and maybe add new ones, right? Purely on the AT side, you're likely using the content library. If you're not super familiar with Appspace, it is what it sounds like. It's a place to store and organize your content, basically a repository where you keep it all so that it's ready to go and ready to actually be published out to a screen somewhere, whatever screen that may be. One of the kind of common missteps that we'll see when people start using Appspace is they just kind of jump right in. And you can certainly do that. And don't get me wrong, I get the impulse too when I get a new piece of software, a new toy, whatever it might be. I also just want to kind of jump right in and start using it. And it's very easy to then end up with a very unorganized content library, because you just kind of add content as you go, create content as you go, whatever. And a week, a month, a couple of years down the line, suddenly you just got kind of a big pile of stuff sitting there that's very hard to pick through, very hard to stay organized, very hard to figure out what you need to keep and what needs to go. So you want to make sure that you organize your library into folders, right? Actually take the time to organize it. Have a common naming convention for those folders, something that's meaningful to users, that people are going to be able to figure out, what they're looking at. Typically, we see that structure based on maybe location, department, or campaign. Usually, honestly, all three, right? So you might have different folders of content for different office buildings, maybe different departments within those buildings. So the HR team might have their own little section. The marketing team might have their own little section, and so on. And we'll also see kind of subdivisions based on campaigns. So if like benefits enrollment is a big one, right? You might have a separate section just for the content related to that, or a new product enhancement that we're really excited about, right? Any of those kind of things, sometimes you'll see it delineated that way as well. Lastly, and this is something that I'll show you guys in the platform, you can utilize user group libraries where appropriate as well. And that's something I definitely want to touch on, because it's not one of those things that's immediately obvious, but it's very powerful and also just very important to know about. So that being said, give me 1 second. I'm going to jump over to the platform. We'll take a look at the content library just to kind of show you what that looks like in practice. So here we are. I'm logged into a demo account. It's got a lot going on, so we can kind of pick it apart here. But I'm just going to jump straight to the content library to see some examples in action. So here's my content library. It's got quite a few folders built out here at the left. So I've got folders for different purposes, Appspace videos, branding assets, customer demos in my case, right, with a bunch of different subfolders here to stay organized. Just an example of how you might set that up. That kind of organization, naming scheme, that is entirely up to you, right? Whatever makes sense to you, but it's just important to have a scheme, right? Have an idea in mind as you start to build out your library. The one aspect that I really do want to point out are those user group-based libraries. So if you notice here at the left, I do have all these folders, and they're all under this heading Appspace Marketing. That's because Appspace Marketing is a user group that I belong to. Now, I also actually belong to a couple of other user groups. I belong to a user group named after myself, so I'm the only member of that user group. I also belong to a second user group that I named after myself that I use to demo like a lower level, kind of lower access user. What's important to note about that is that each user group can have its own separate content library, and they are completely separate. So if you have HR folks, for example, classic kind of setup, who have a bunch of content related to HR messaging, obviously HR can be very touchy, right? Just in terms of the nature of the messaging. It's important that HR people are messaging it and it's not getting diluted or the wrong message isn't being sent out. So it pays often to have them have their own content library, right? Where they can add their own HR content, they can edit that content, update it, but no one else can really touch it. So having an HR user group, having those users in that group to where they get their own separate content library that no one else can mess with can be very important. Now, a couple of notes on that. You can belong to multiple user groups, as I do, so keep that in mind. So I belong to both Appspace Marketing and my own little user group. And you can also share out folders between groups. So for example, these branding assets, maybe I want to share them with other user groups. I want to keep them in the marketing folder because marketing's the one that really works with that, but I want to make them available for other groups. I can use that share button and share between other user groups, or maybe just share it across all user groups for everybody to have access to. Last thing I'll show real quick before we move on to the next topic is I'm actually going to jump over to the user section in Appspace because I want to make sure it's apparent how you actually manage those user groups. So here I am, I've got all my different users, I've got a ton of user groups here at the left. If I click to add a new user group with the plus sign, there's actually just a quick toggle to enable that user group's library. So again, if you want to give them their own library, that's where you would find that option. So jumping back to our topics here, next topic to talk about is actually one that we somewhat covered in a previous webinar when we talked about card themes, and that's using themes to separate different types of content. So card themes, the ability to lock in your branding, your colors, logos, fonts, etc. Obviously very important just from a design standpoint and from a brand standard standpoint, but also very useful for staying organized, right? For making sure the right messages are delivered in the right way. You could brand all of your messaging the exact same way. Works pretty well. It's certainly better than kind of a Wild West, where everybody's just uploading whatever they want. But it really does pay to have slightly different templates, slightly different themes for maybe different messaging purposes. So again, using the HR department that I'm picking on this particular webinar, they might have a particular set of HR themed cards. Again, they meet brand standards. They look similar to marketing cards, to message from leadership cards, right? But they might have a certain kind of look and feel that cues in the user, cues in the viewer in terms of what type of message they're about to receive. There are some practical elements to that too, in terms of making sure the right users have the right cards. So again, jumping back to Appspace, I'm actually going to open up my main menu over here at the left, go down to System, and go to Cards, because that's where you actually manage these themes. And again, this was a topic of a previous webinar. So when you're looking at your themes here, any that we've created, right, stock themes that are already available, or any that you've created or that you've modified, you'll notice that over here at the right, you'll see by default, this little blue link says everyone. So as an example, I'm going to lock a theme down. Everyone means that everyone can use that theme. But in this case, I've got this marketing card here. Maybe I only want that Appspace marketing user group to have access. So I can click start typing and give access to that Appspace marketing user group. So then only they can use that theme. Other users wouldn't be able to. Next, just moving on kind of the logical content publishing workflow here. It's important to keep your channels organized as well. So channels being the actual way you publish content out into the world. Definitely recommend having easy to understand titles for those channels, including location is always helpful. Something like, location, building or floor, right? So Dallas lobby welcome signage, something like that, to use a local example to me. Pretty common. Obviously, again, that nomenclature is up to you guys, but keep it consistent, keep it clear, because it's just going to make it easier to, if you're an admin and you can access everything, it's going to make it easier to find what you need. And it's also going to make it easier to make sure that lower level users who have much more limited access can only access the channels that are appropriate, that you can just point them in the right direction or assign permissions to the right one. Moving along to user roles, user groups, etc. Kind of once you've done some of that thinking about who should be doing what in the platform, you can actually then go in and start building out those user roles, building out that access. But of course, first, like I said, it's important to think about and maybe even start those conversations with those users before you even add them to Appspace, right? Before you even provision them. So you want to establish content stakeholders, account admins, content contributors, right? All these different levels, all these different roles you might envision depending on how much freedom you want to give your users to add content and publish, or how tightly you need to keep those reins, right? You need to have strict approvals and that sort of thing. Once you've kind of got that idea, then you can really start to define your user structure and your workflows and actually assign those permissions. There are a lot of different levels of permissions with Appspace. We've got some great articles. In fact, there's an article that goes through every possible permission you can add, what exactly it gives access to. That's all in our Knowledge Center. So that's a great resource. And again, you can always reach out to our customer success team for a little bit of help on this. But big picture, right? You're going to have top level admins. They could be technical admins, right? More just concerned with the day-to-day operating, making sure that all the devices are up and running. They could be more on the kind of the marketing or corporate communications or employee engagement level, right? Top level admins who are pushing out kind of global content, corporate messaging, and so on. You could have more mid-range admins that are in charge of approving content in the channels they're responsible for. So maybe all the signage in one building, they can approve the content, make sure it looks good, and so on. And then, of course, you'll have your lower level users that are just contributing content, maybe to just the 1 or 2 screens they have access to. So someone who's in charge of events and welcoming visitors, right? They might update the front lobby screen with those welcome messages, and that might be the extent of their role, right? They have access to one channel, and maybe even then they're subject to approval. So you're able to assign those roles in app. The one thing I'll mention on that is you always assign access at the object you want to give them access to. So in that example, if you want to give someone access to that front lobby channel, you'd go to that front lobby channel, and that's where naming is important, go to the permissions tab and give them access there. Lastly, once you've kind of figured this out, as you start to invite those users, assign roles, or if it's an existing deployment, add new users, shift people around, whatever you're doing, it's always important to have a little bit of a training with those users. At least just a quick overview, a quick email saying like, hey, here's what you can do, here's what you're in charge of, here's where you click, if not a more formalized training. It just sets it off on the right foot. It kind of gets people in the right mindset. Makes it a lot easier than just, telling them to log in and go, even if they're very limited, right? Even if their view is just one channel, it still helps to give them that context. So we highly encourage that to make sure that the deployment goes smoothly, that it's organized, and it's going to be successful in the long term. We can also help with that training if you need. You can reach out to your account executive, your account manager, or your customer success manager. We do those kind of trainings for folks all the time, whether it's more of a general overview training or a very particularly targeted training. So if you have a group of users that has a very particular job in mind, it can be tailored for that purpose as well. So I want to move on a little bit to kind of the, higher level organization of an Appspace deployment. Those first few topics we talked about, those are applicable no matter how you deploy Appspace, right? What are your channels? What's your content? How are your users accessing and interacting with those elements? What we want to talk about now are networks. If you're new to Appspace, what a network is a way to split your Appspace instance, your Appspace deployment, up into separate silos or sandboxes within the platform. So even though you've got one Appspace subscription, one Appspace account, you might kind of partition that off so that maybe different regions have their own kind of little sandbox they play in and can't touch other regions, or different departments, things like that. It can be a useful tool, but it's not a tool you should just always use just because it's there. And that's kind of what we laid out here. For some deployments, it makes sense to not really have multiple networks, to just have one single network, which is the default, by the way. When you sign up for a demo account or start a brand new account with Appspace, you'll just have one network. That is probably the simplest deployment structure, right? You have one network, everything is in one place, makes it very easy to manage. In terms of being an admin, you see everything all at one glance. There's not a lot of jumping around. So it's worth considering whether sticking with one network might be the way to go. If you have a smaller deployment, great, that's probably the way to go. If you have a very tightly managed deployment, so if most all of your content, most all of your publishing is coming from on high, right? It's very centralized, you've got a very strict messaging guidelines, you've got maybe a corp comm team that handles that, then single network, again, probably the way to go because they want to be able to see everything all at once. As it says there, a couple of bullet points, a couple of advantages. One, it's very simple to assign user access on a per channel basis. So even if you do have some low level users that are contributing content in a very narrow kind of lane, right? Maybe just 1 or 2 screens, 1 or 2 channels, that's still super easy to do with a single network deployment. To that user, they won't know that everything's there, right? They log in, they go to their channels, they see the one channel they've been accessed to, everything else is hidden from them. So for those low-level users, it really doesn't make a difference. It keeps it very simple to just give them the access they need. For your admins, the folks that have a lot of access, It simplifies things a little bit in that there's no extra UI navigation required. There's no clicking around to find what you need. It's all right there. Makes it very easy to just search for the channels and devices you need, right? Again, it's all in one list, so you can just type in the search bar, find what you want, or scroll down. And then there's no concern about whether a user can access what they need, right? Because everything is in one spot. You just assign the access, you're done. So there are some advantages. Now, multi-network also comes with some advantages, but obviously if you're adding multiple networks, that adds a little bit of complexity. Now, before I dig into some of those advantages, I do want to jump back over to Appspace and kind of show you what that would look like. So to do so, I'm going to go here in my account to devices. The first page of devices is, of course, all of my actual devices. So any signage or collaboration displays or room booking displays, et cetera, that I'm powering with Appspace. But up here at the top, there's a networks tab that will show me all of my different networks. So again, each network is its own kind of sandbox in Appspace. They are completely separate. So they are a way to partition out the platform. So for example, you'll see as I click on these, each network could have its own set of users, its own set of devices, its own set of channels, right? Again, completely isolated. In this case, I do have a network tree built out. So that's an important point I wanted to make is you can utilize hierarchical networks. So up here at the very top, I've got my global corporate network. If I was going for a single network deployment, that would be the only one I have. All of my users, all of my devices, all of my channels would just be in that top level network. In this case, though, I've built out a tree. So I've actually done it by region, which is one of the most common ways to organize. So I've got a United States network. Beneath that, a couple of different states have their own network. And then beneath that, even some cities have their own network. So it's just a nice way to keep things hierarchical, keep them organized, and again, separate out those parts of the Appspace deployment. In terms of organizing these networks or creating these networks, again, geographically is what we see most commonly because usually different regions or different buildings or things like that would have different kind of content they want to push. But another successful way to organize your network would be by maybe by purpose or department. So that could be by little department, like the marketing team maybe has their own network if they manage their own signage, something like that. But another one that's really useful, even if you only have two networks, right, not a huge network tree, is something like internal and external. So if you have content you're pushing externally to a lobby, right, that the general public can see, or to an actual branch or something, right, where you have actual customers walking in, you might have a separate network for those displays versus your internal signage and your internal collaboration displays and meeting room displays that are probably managed by a whole different team, that content's published by a different team, and honestly, it has different goals, right? So separating those out into two separate networks can be very effective just to keep that hard divide. Now, we'll get back to the bullet points in terms of advantages, but one of the main advantages of breaking up your deployment this way is that it allows for kind of mid-range admins. So I mentioned earlier, you might have top-level admins who can kind of control everything, right? They are the primary stakeholders. You might have very low-level users that can just update the content on a couple of screens or in one building or something like that. With networks, you can add mid-range admins, so content and network administrators. You'll see that listed in permissions here. That have a lot of control, but only within their own little network. So for example, if you had a user, when you were thinking about those users earlier, that you need to have a lot of control to be kind of the manager of all the deployment, all the signage, all the content within Los Angeles, every single office, every single screen in Los Angeles, that's where networks would be great because you could give them that role, make them maybe a content administrator there. So they could publish content to any screen. They can check up on the content, make sure it looks good, right? They can do all those things, but only within their little domain. They couldn't jump up the tree to all of California or the US. They couldn't jump over to the San Diego network and mess with their signage, right? They're going to be locked in their own little kind of kingdom. So very useful for that. You can also use the hierarchy to your advantage there. So you can do the same thing for someone maybe in California, right? So they're in charge of all of California. Not only could they manage any signage there, but they could jump down to those lower levels as well. So that's where that really shines. We covered most of these bullet points when I was in the actual platform itself, but I do want to point out those content admins and network admins do let you kind of give people different levels of access as needed. So content admins can manage all channels and content within the network. So that's the actual publishing portion. Network admins can manage users and devices within a single network and the subnetworks. So that's more kind of the IT management. If you have a local IT person maybe that needs to get alerts if devices go down, that needs to be able to add and manage devices just within that that region or that office or however you do work, that can be a useful role there as well. Lastly, I know I've been talking a lot. We're coming up towards the end. Creating a content strategy is important. We kind of talked about this again on previous webinars, but make sure you have content owners, content creators, know who's in charge of what screen, what type of content they should be publishing. You want to tailor that content based on location, based on device, based on how it's going to be kind of actually viewed and absorbed. And you want to make sure that content's fresh. Again, this is a bullet point we like to hammer home in a lot of these webinars, but being organized just enables that, right? You don't want stale content. Stale content leads to disengagement. It leads to people blowing past the screen because they feel like they've seen it before, even if there's something new after months of stale content, right? So you want to keep people engaged, keep it organized, make it as easy as possible to keep that content fresh, to keep those eyes on the screen, to get the right information out to the right people. And that last bullet point, I do want to point out, schedule regular strategy reviews for key stakeholders. It's important to reevaluate. So we're talking about, organizing your Appspace deployment. That's not just for a new deployment, that's for existing deployments. It always pays to take a step back, make sure things are working the way they're supposed to, the way you want them to. Maybe take a moment and think if they can be organized better. Again, always talk to us if you want some help with that. But it's a great thing to do, to take some time to do once you've kind of rolled out Appspace or as you have an ongoing deployment, to take a moment to review those kind of goals, those strategies. And one thing I will throw out there, just as a little preview, we're actually in the process of overhauling some of our kind of console metrics to give you better insight into that. So you can see, what users are most engaged, what channels are most updated, what content types are people most publishing. So keep an eye out for that in the future. Last couple of things, you've seen this if you've been on our previous webinars. We do have a lot of resources available. So card gallery, channel gallery with pre-made content you can add to your account. You can edit it, you can tweak it, you can do whatever you want with it. But it's a nice kind of stepping stone to launch into a deployment. We even have some COVID-19 specific resources that give best practices around staying safe, safe work environments, and so on. We also have a professional services team. So if you want help with kind of hitting the ground running, so you can worry about getting people involved and not have to worry about your templates and all that kind of stuff, we can help with that. And then lastly, as I mentioned, there is a survey after this webinar. If you wouldn't mind clicking through, give us ideas for new webinars, tell us whether you like this one or not, and also product feedback, right? If what you saw here today, your experience in the platform, what you want to do, if you're not quite sure how to make it happen, right? If it's a workflow that doesn't exist yet, let us know what that ideal use case looks like. We'll take that back to our product team to see if it can be incorporated. We always want to hear how people are actually using Appspace out in the real world. So I know I talked a lot there. We're actually right at the limit, but let me see if I can get a couple of quick questions in before we wrap up. Like I said, we're going to have a recording of this. We're going to have a follow-up, so there will be more info. For content that needs to be sent out and broadcast globally, is there a time setting in Appspace that adjusts with the time zone automatically? So that's a great question. The good news there is that all scheduling, so if you schedule content to go out at 9 a.m., for example, is based off the local device time. So if you schedule it for 9 a.m. to blast out globally, it is going to be 9 a.m. local time because that local player device, right, a traditional digital signage player, a collaboration device, a room scheduling panel, whatever, it's got its internal clock, and it's going to be based off that, so it will automatically adjust. Can you move content from one user group library to another group library if you're a member of user groups? You 100% can. So if you click and drag content from one folder to another, it'll move it. If you click and drag from one library to another, so this scenario, it's actually going to create a copy of that content in the new content library as well. So it'll still be in the old one. You'll just add a copy to that new one just to make sure that you've got it where it needs to be. If you move a piece of content in the library, will it affect the screens if the content is live? We have several existing live channels, and some of the default uploads have ended up in an unassigned folder, and we'd like to move them. You can do that, particularly with the unassigned folder. So it's a good topic I didn't really dig into. I just kind of gave you the tips to not end up there. But unassigned is where content ends up if you don't create that folder structure, right, and don't kind of organize it as you go. It just ends up being kind of a big dumping ground for any content. If you have that, and pretty much everyone does, myself included, right? You're kind of just doing things on the fly. You can drag content out of that unassigned folder into an actual folder you've made, and it won't mess up the publishing. We're still referencing that content directly in the playlist, so that won't be impacted at all. You can reorganize that as needed. The one exception I'll throw out there is in our playlist channels. If you're familiar, you can do folder publishing. It's where not the unassigned bin. Again, that's kind of its own thing. But if you create a folder and you do folder publishing and point that channel to that folder and you take content out of that folder, well, then it's going to disappear from the channel because that's kind of the point there, right? It's a live link to that folder. But yeah, unassigned bin, reorganizing normally, you can definitely do that. And a question that has come up before as well, whether users have to be network admins to publish channels, is that still the case? So it can be. If you've been using Appspace for a long time and you haven't seen some of the most recent updates or you haven't really dug into them, there are different modes you can put a device in. So the traditional kind of mode, the way that Appspace has worked the longest, way back in the day, is that it requires an admin to assign a single channel or a single playlist to the device. And yes, that does require a network admin or higher role because it is specifically a kind of admin assignment. You lock that device down. We have added a mode called autoplay in addition to our channel browsing mode, which is more interactive. But autoplay basically lets content admins or publishers of channels to actually publish their channels directly to those devices. So an admin, like a network administrator, might set that device to autoplay to start, but from that point forward, your content folks can manage what channel goes where via the publish tab in the channel itself. Have you seen web published channels help connect people and messages since more people are working remotely? So we talked about this a little bit. We did add the ability to publish channels to the web. You can either get a direct link, you can embed code to throw into an internet page, so that's an option. All the permissions and publishing works the same, just a different way to get that content out there. We've seen that used pretty effectively, especially kind of embedding an intranet. Another thing that is right around the corner from going GA that we've been testing, some of you guys might already know about this, is the ability to publish into collaboration apps as well. So WebEx Teams, Microsoft Teams, and Slack. Just another way to get that content out there. That's been super well received from folks who've had a chance to play around with it. Because of course, most everyone's in those apps all day. So the ability to get that content directly in front of them, maybe with additional context for articles, links, etc., has been a big boost. So if you haven't already seen materials about that, we've got a little bit about it now. You're going to see more and more about that. So stay tuned there. I think there are probably some more questions. We're already over time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. If there are some common threads, we'll try to respond to them in general, or if not, you can always reach out to us, to your customer success manager, our support team, etc., to get some of those answered. I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Like I said, it's going to redirect to that survey. Just click through and it'll take you to it. But otherwise, I hope you all have a great day.